Well, good afternoon. Okay, it's good to see all of you here. I'm Camilla Benbow, the Dean of the Peabody College, and I am so glad to have all of you joined us for this first Dean's Diversity Lecture of this academic year. To launch the third year of this series, we decided to have a panel discussion. When we began this series, we hoped to explore important questions around race, gender, sexuality, and inclusiveness. This year, we begin with a consideration of ableism. Peabody has a long history of advocating for people with intellectual or developmental disabilities, impairments, or with learning differences. But we also know there is much that can and that must be done. Far too often, people who are differently abled are the victims of others' ignorance, aversion, or hostility. The solution, of course, is to increase awareness, and that's what we're going to try to do this afternoon. I am pleased that the panel we've assembled brings lots of wisdom and experience to bear on this important topic. I will let our moderator introduce the panelists, but first let me introduce her. Anjali Forber-Pratt is an assistant professor of human and organizational development and is now in her third year of teaching at Vanderbilt. Anjali is a scholar of disability, identity development, and perceptions of victimization in people with disabilities. Uniquely, she is also an amazing ambassador for athletes with disabilities, having held a world record as a wheelchair racer. Anjali competed in the Paralympic Games in Beijing, where she won 2 bronze medals, and at the Games in London in 2012. Anjali is an inspiring symbol of achievement for athletes of all abilities, and I would say also an inspiring symbol of achievement for academics of all tastes and stripes. And I'd like to turn it over to Anjali at this point. Thank you. And I want to also thank her for organizing this panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first off, just a couple of quick access notes for everyone. We do have some ASL interpreters who are present. If folks need to adjust their seating for a better vantage point, please feel free to do so. There will be a stream of this event, and captions and a transcript will be added as soon as possible after the event. We will spend about 45 minutes answering some prepared questions, and then have some time for about 15 minutes of question and answer from you all. I will say when it comes time for the question and answer, please wait for the microphone, even if you have a loud voice, as this helps for access for all. So first of all, a huge thank you to Dean Camilla Benbow for supporting this amazing event and having the diversity lecture focused on issues related to disability and ableism. And also a thank you to her entire staff, and as well as to my students who are here, and members of my research lab, and others of the Vanderbilt and Nashville disability community who helped to contribute to making this evening a success. This evening, we have 3 lovely panelists who have joined us here in Nashville and remotely, as you see on the screen. So I'm going to introduce a little bit about each of our panelists. First of all, to my left is attorney Claudia Gordon. Claudia is a senior manager for government and compliance with Sprint Accessibility. Before joining Sprint in March, Claudia was a member of the Obama administration from 2009 until 2017. And she served initially as a special assistant to the director of the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, and then as the office's chief of staff. She also held a temporary assignment as the associate director at the White House Office of Public Engagement, where she was a liaison to the disability community and advised on disability policies, which was where we first met. Notably, Claudia served as a member of President Obama's presidential delegation to the opening ceremony of the 2016 Paralympic Summer Games in Rio de Janeiro, and has held many other posts related to civil rights, She is also the first black female deaf lawyer in the United States. Rock star. To her left is Jill Houghton. Jill is president and CEO of the U.S. Business Leadership Network, also known as USBLN, where she works incentive programs for individuals with disabilities. She currently serves on the board of the U.S. International Council on Disabilities and the New York Comptroller's Advisory Council on Economic Growth through Diversity and Inclusion. Another rock star. And on the screen behind me is Alice Wong. Alice is the founder and project coordinator of the Disability Visibility Project, which collects oral histories of people with disabilities in the United States. The Disability Visibility Project was created on the 25th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 and has become a loud and powerful voice in disability justice spaces. Alice also serves on the advisory board as a member of the Asians and Pacific Islanders with Disabilities of California and is a presidential appointee to the National Council on Disability, which advises the President, Congress, and many other federal agencies. In 2015, she attended the reception at the White House for the 25th anniversary of the ADA via telepresence robot. She was the first person to visit the White House and the presence via robot presence. She's joining us not quite by robot here today, but virtually, thanks to amazing technology and support. Yet another rock star. Welcome, Alice. So without further ado, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome my fellow comrades and disability activists here to Vanderbilt. And I'd like for each of our panelists, and we'll start with you, Claudia, to spend about 5 minutes describing who you are and what your connection is to disability and what your career path has looked like.
Thank you for that very lovely introduction, and I feel honored to be here today, and it's a privilege to be on this panel with my colleagues, with you, Jill, and Alice as well. You both are just amazing individuals, and you too, of course. And it's been a pleasure to meet her. We met at the White House, where I was the liaison for the disability community, and it was an honor to have several young leaders and their work to be advanced within the disability rights issues on the actual anniversary of the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, and she was one of the champions in leading that, and such a cherished friend and colleague since then. And I love sharing this stage with you today. Okay, pardon me. I'm going to spend 5 minutes talking about myself. Okay, this will be tough. Where to start? Okay, a little bit of a background. I'm originally from the Jamaican Islands, and literally suddenly overnight became deaf when I was 8 years old. And that was truly a life-changing experience for me. You know, going from a normal childhood to all of a sudden, overnight, becoming a member of the disability community. In Jamaica, there was really no proper labeling, diagnoses, or understanding of disability, or even what the term meant. It was more of a stigma there. And there was a lot of negative stereotypes and beliefs. So instead of seeing someone who couldn't hear, you know, a deaf person, you would be more likely to be called dumb there. You know, somebody who may have Alzheimer's, you know, or mad. So it was truly a horrible, oppressive, and very isolating and exclusionary experience, and for people who have disabilities there. And truly threw us all off. And, you know, you go through this, what's my life's purpose? You know, and in talking about ableism, you know, which after I lost my hearing, even though I was a bright kid, and you know, my family and my school together decided that I should no longer continue my education. So I was kept at home for almost 3 years after losing my hearing. Because basically, they believed that somebody who is deaf, it was impossible to educate them. Now, fortunately, I had my mother who was quite stubborn. and decided to move to New York, to the Bronx, which is where I started continuing my education. I went to the School for the Deaf, and I met deaf peers for the first time, and I realized I was not the only deaf person in the world. And that slowly led to my journey as, you know, going through what I went through and my own self-acceptance and my own self-identity as a person who is deaf. You know, I denied it for years because of the negative connotation with that label. Being deaf or having another disability in Jamaica was such a negative thing. And this was an overnight thing for me. And so I have come from there to where I am now, sitting here on this panel with no shame and lots of pride and no reason to hide that I have a disability. And that's been a life's journey for me. And, you know, that's what got me really into disability and advocacy and social justice. I think now, looking back, I feel it was a blessing in disguise. It's not something that was understood at the time, but at this time, I would not change my life experience and my journey for anything else. It taught me resilience. It taught me values. And it allowed me to be able to come across the most amazing people in my life. Doors of opportunities that were open for me would not have been if that did not happen, and led me to the path that I'm on. So there's a brief synopsis of who I am.
Thank you. Jill?
Let me start off by saying thank you, Anjali, and thank you, Vanderbilt, for hosting us. And it's a pleasure to be here alongside Claudia and Alice and Anjali, total rock stars. So thank you. I don't like to talk about myself, really, but that's what I've been asked to do. So my story is that I grew up in a little town in Kansas called Pittsburgh, where people honk to say hello, not get out of my way. I have a learning disability. And so when I was in school and it came time to start learning how to read and write, I wrote things backwards and didn't know how to tie my shoes. Still don't know how to tie my shoes, and didn't do so well at reading. But I have really cool parents who got involved and got me the support that I needed. I'll tell you, at the time, I didn't really understand. I was embarrassed that I had to go to a different classroom and sit at a little tiny table, because I was always the tall kid. Sitting at a little tiny table and in a room where the other kids weren't. I didn't like that. So having a learning disability wasn't something that I was particularly proud of or something that I ever talked about. Fast forward to as I progressed through school, you know, in high school, things like math and multiple choice tests, you know, don't necessarily put me in the best light. So I had to work really hard to make it. I took the test to go to college, and it said, you know, I couldn't go to college, but I went to college, of course, and knew how to go to my professors and ask to take tests untimed, you know, et cetera, in different environments. And then fast forward, I wanted to be a lawyer like Claudia. And I took the LSAT, and I did horrible. I completely bombed it, and we had to have the family convention because, again, I have like amazing parents. And we had to sit down and we had to talk about the fact that I'm not stupid, but that testing doesn't necessarily put me in the best light. And so that being said, it was like, okay, so let's develop a plan A, plan B, you know, plan out what are we going to do here? And part of the plan was to go to Washington, D.C., because I was really interested in social justice. And not necessarily disability, because this wasn't something that I wanted to own or talk about, because I was really embarrassed and I thought that it made you look stupid. So I went to Washington and had the opportunity to work for my senator, who was Senator Dole. And it was during the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it really started to set the course for the future of the path that I chose. Fast forward, along my journey, I met a man who I married who has a spinal cord injury. So, you know, I may not necessarily encounter a lot of ableism personally because I've got a learning disability that you can't see, although now I've come to be proud and own it and be out and recognize that it's part of who I am. But I certainly experience it via being the wife of a man who happens to use a wheelchair. So I get to experience things alongside my husband, Andy. Currently, I lead an organization called the U.S. Business Leadership Network, and we unite business around disability. And I believe that if ever there was a time, the time is now to be out and proud, and that business has a role to play in changing ableism and driving inclusion.
Thank you. Alice, do you want to share a little bit about your story?
Yeah, hey everyone, it's a like to be here online and with you all today. So in addition to collecting oral histories, the Disability and Disability Project is more of an online community that creates, shares, and amplifies disability media and culture. And I was talking about the people about today's events. You know, I think one of the ways of, you know, confronting ableism is to create media and to tell our stories. Because I do think that most narratives about disability in the mainstream media are really not told from an authentic perspective. Just to back up, I guess, I just say that my parents immigrated to Indiana, of all places, to Montreal in the early 1970s, and I was their first student born in the U.S. I have a neuromuscular disability, since birth, and that basically means that all my muscles were weakened over time. So when I was a kid, I was able to walk. I started in a wheelchair when I was about 7 or 6 or 7. And needed additional supports throughout my life. And as you see, I'm wearing this mask. And this vestments connected to the sheet on my back. And this gives me ventilatory support, so I could have breathe and talk a little easier and can save my energy that way. So thank God for technology. And thank God for the internet. So my background is really academic. I'm a double major in English and sociology as an undergrad. I know there's some people in the audience who are in liberal arts. But what about liberal arts? Okay. Gotta represent, you know? I got into sociology because I really wanted to understand why meetings develop and power dynamics to groups. Because being a disabled child, I really, was right in it. I experienced a lot of ableism and discrimination, and I didn't understand why that was. And, learning about sociology really gave me this foundation and the courage to talk about it. So I did CSF, University of California, San Francisco, for graduate school, and focused on medical sociology. And I ended up doing more sociology about healthcare and people with disabilities. And started working as a staff research assistant at UCSF right after graduation. in terms of qualitative research, but also being activists, I think, just purely from being a disabled human being in a world that was really not good for us. So my activism life has really come more to the forefront. I left my job earlier this year and now focus full-time on the disability physical projects while being a freelance consultant. So that's my story for now.
Wonderful, thank you. So for our panelists, what does ableism mean to you and how has it affected your life? So some of you touched on pieces of this in your opening remarks, but let's dive a little bit deeper. Whoever wants to start.
Can I jump in? Is that right?
Sure.
Okay, I'm just thinking about this because there are a lot of different definitions of ableism that are out there, and one day somebody was interviewing me, and I do this very rambling answer, and it's like, oh my gosh, what is that really? How do I distill it? And how do I kind of explain it? And I think for me, you know, ableism is this feeling that people with disabilities are just not enough. I think to me that's kind of, you know, one of the biggest kind of takeaways is that somehow our bodies, our minds, the way we move, the way we are in the world, we're just not enough. So it's affected my life in the sense that I've kind of had to really undo the harm from those messages and the forces that shapes the systems and institutions and spaces that we inhabit. And I think the ways I've been trying to undo that harm is to create community and to really create spaces where we can be unapologetic, we can be proud, we can share our culture and our lives with others. And I think that's what's helped me the most. Trying to feel like I'm not alone and knowing that we have power as a community with one another.
Anyone else have any thoughts?
Okay. I definitely want to reinforce what Alice just said and want to say something without repeating what was said. I mean, truly, it's ableism. It's funny, growing up, we didn't have that term. You know, that was not part of my vocabulary. And over time, in looking back and reflecting on experiences that have happened in our lives, that's when we go, ah, that's ableism. But during the time, we didn't have that label for that treatment, that behavior. So sitting on this table, at this panel, you know, it's something that I'm thinking about, you know, being pulled from school, even though I was one of the top students in class, at 8 years old. I think that was my first experience looking back, the first encounter with ableism, when it came to the school and the family making this decision without no inquiry with me of how I felt. You know, it was important for people to understand that I could be taught. Anybody can be taught. You know, and to be able to say that at 8 would have been wonderful. And since then, there's been countless encounters with ableism. So I think it's a societal structure of behavior and a way of thinking based on the stereotypes. You know, those that think people with disabilities are not able to do such and such rather than what they are able to do and accomplish. You know, people have destinies and can achieve things in their lives and can be a full human being. And as a person who happens to be a woman, a person of color, and somebody with a disability, and an immigrant, I mean, you have all these different identities within one, and I embrace them all. there's no hierarchy of my own identities, of who I am. And these are just all my characteristics. But when I try to go into a different space, and I work on with the administration and with the gender differences, you know, I am a woman. I should have equal pay for the same work that I'm doing as a man, including with civil rights struggles as an African American because I'm black. And often going into places, in my experiences, even at Howard University, it was not necessarily a welcoming experience. You know, women looked at me as, oh, well, you're deaf, you should be over there. You know, and with Howard University, even though it's a black college, again, I'm a person with disability, I'm in the wrong place, so I need to be over there. So it's a societal way of viewing things and checking off the box and which box you fit in. And you know, it should be, you have a right to advocate, and for what, you know? It shouldn't be determined for me. So I truly struggled with that since I was 8 to today, and it's an ongoing daily struggle.
And yeah, and I would add, I mean, so I wasn't familiar with the term either at growing up, but it is a societal challenge, and there's this assumption that people with disabilities, you know, can't. That it could be something as basic on a college university, you know, on a college campus, that we don't have that many students with disabilities. You know, we don't need to caption things, or we don't need to make that building accessible over there in the front because it's accessible in the back. You know, like, well, no, that's not okay. We see it in everything that we do. I experienced it this week. You know, I went to this huge diversity conference. I mean, thousands of people, and nothing was accessible. Huge lunches, no interpreters, no captioning, no screens, you know, I mean, bad access, tables on top of tables, chairs on top of chairs. They're up there, they're talking diversity and inclusion for women, for minorities, for LGBT, but not disability. And then they took it a step further, and they had this whole breakout session called the Bigger Discussion. And they said to me, you sit on the front row, not on the stage, and we'll call your name and you can stand up and wave.
Wow.
To me, that's a society, that's ableism at its finest, right? That's just being, you know, pushed off to the side.
Yeah, and I think that this is the problem when we talk about diversity, is that ableism really does show up because people don't become that regard as diversity or as an importance. That disability, individual, you know, impairment, or individuals versus healthcare or diagnosis is not about this community and culture of people. You know, I think that's a huge problem, that, you know, ableism is everywhere, and it's in everything, and it's invisible for the most part because it's so embedded in everything that's organized in our society. You know, just think, I think most people, when they think about this, not as mobile or healthy, that's really about being non-disabled. So it's really weird to talk about ableism is really important. An invitation for non-disabled people to really unpack their privilege and to think about what does it mean to be disabled. Is it necessarily first I did maybe is, and as long as it's healthy. But what does that mean when we're talking about the values, that we're kind of suggesting that as a baby was born with a disability? What does that mean? Does that mean they're damaged goods? What does that say? So that's kind of what I wanted to share.
Yeah, and so I'm curious, with all of these experiences and examples of ableism that you shared, and building on some of Alice's remarks, how can we engage better allyship with folks here in the audience, so that we also don't run into the space of tokenizing those of us with disabilities to be the ones to provide those solutions? And these are hard questions, so I don't expect easy answers. So how can folks like who are here in the audience really show and demonstrate allyship, so that the burden of responsibility is not always on the person with the disability?
I think it starts with listening and learning. I think people without disabilities should actually listen, and people with disabilities are possibly critiquing or at a point of view that makes you uncomfortable or disrupts your idea of what's considered standard or normal. I think that's the whole work that you all should do. I think part of this having conversations with actual disabled people and treating them as if they are the ones with important concerns. And I think it's really simple, just mutual respect and openness to kind of see things from another perspective, and also be open about, we all have implicit biases. I am constantly working through my stuff as well. And I think it's really about just being willing to learn and being willing to be vulnerable about what we don't know.
One thing that I would recommend that we're seeing a lot in corporate America, and for that matter, probably on college campuses as well, is, in corporate America, there are these things called employee resource groups or business resource groups, and I think that you have groups on campus as well. So, there's a group for women, and there's a group for veterans and LGBT and disability, and there are groups where people come together. And not just people, for example, in the disability group that have a disability, it may be an ally, and come together to try to link these conversations to the bigger picture, to really driving that culture change. And I think we see the greatest strides when these groups work across each other as opposed to in silos. So, when you see the veterans and the women and when you see the cross-fertilization, we're starting to see strides. I was with a really large corporation last week, and they have these things called ambassadors. And so they have people in the workforce that identify as being either an ally of disability inclusion or an individual with a disability. And they're out and they're proud, and they're looking for opportunities, whether they're the individual or the ally, to make the workplace more accessible and more inclusive. And to the extent that you can leverage that practice on, university campuses as well, that's like a concrete thing.
Well, there are a couple things I would like to add. As you talk about willing to learn, Alice, you mentioned that. I'd like to add to that, the allyship needs to be based on people being willing to unlearn as well. Unlearn the negative stereotypes, unlearn the beliefs that were wrong, you know, the things you were taught growing up. So just a whole different, you know, have a different environment of peers, cultures, traditions, you know, they're all part of us, and we have to be willing to unlearn those things as well as learn. In addition to that, I think it's important too that individuals refrain from perceiving people with disabilities like myself or Alice or Jill, you know, going, oh wow, you're a CEO, oh my goodness, with a learning disability, like, you're so inspiring. Okay, look, we're not here to inspire you. I mean, I'm glad we inspire and you know, give you a sense of empowerment and teaching you things about resilience and perseverance and not feeling, you know, unable to beat the odds. I mean, but I don't want praise for accomplishments of things that others can do as well and are as of deserving as well. I went to college, you went to college, you got a degree, I got a degree. I mean, it's one of those things where it's celebrating me because I'm an attorney that happens to be deaf. Well, if there was no deafness in the equation, I mean, that's still a remarkable accomplishment, right? So we're just living our lives and pursuing our goals and dreams just like anybody else. So for the allies to stop seeing us as, oh, what an inspiration, that would be a step in the right direction. You know, okay, well, they still went to school, were able to graduate from high school, get into college, graduate from there, get a degree, go into law school, get a degree from that. You know, what a way to live your life. We do have a dear disability advocate that has passed, and she was very inspiring, but, you know, inspiration whore, if you will, and I don't want to be that way. Allyship would require, as you said, mutual respect and respect for those that have disabilities. We have our own self-determination. For example, when I was at Howard University, I had applied for the African American Scholarship in a very prominent organization. And I, you know, naively thought I should be able to demonstrate that I was able to make it and get in and get into this hearing university, even though I was deaf, and I was courageous to take these steps. And it was worth it for me to get this scholarship because of that, and this, that, and the other. And the letter I received from the scholarship organization was only 2 or 3 sentences, and basically stated, there is another university by the name of Gallaudet University that focuses in on individuals who are deaf, and they may be better able to meet your needs, and you should consider applying there. I didn't want to go there. I needed the financial assistance to get into Howard University, and I was asking for guidance in what other choices there were that I could make, but they didn't see me as me being a person of color who rightfully could go into Howard University, and they were stuck on the fact that I was deaf. And it goes back to self-determination when those things arise, and that needs to be respected if you're a true ally. And individuals with disabilities, what are their goals? Their own unique goals. And it's all about leveling the playing field. We're not looking for trade-offs or favoritism. We're really not. You all helping level the playing field means that we can collaborate and compete with one another on equal footing. And that's all it is. It's perception. It truly is.
And for me, something about ableism is sort of the systematic nature of it, the systems of power that are at play that unfortunately reinforce or enforce a lot of what it is that we're talking about. And so building on these comments, I'm curious, when we think about not wanting accomplishments to be a handout or going into the inspiration porn side of things, how can we get qualified people with disabilities to get degrees and to become employed? How can we make sure that we're not perpetuating this notion of handouts, but that we're actually putting forth qualified individuals into our society? I'll start with you, Jill.
Well, culture like eats everything for lunch. There's a saying in it, and that's not the saying, but it's something to that effect. That you can have the best strategies in the world, but if you're not addressing your culture and working on creating a culture where students can be who they are, then nothing else matters, right? So if I was a university, I'd be focusing first on my culture and making sure that we're doing everything in our power to be inclusive, whether it's physical access, digital access, professors with disabilities, like just treating a university like a business and looking across the business at everything from your leadership to your culture to your employment practices to your accessibility to your procurement. Looking at everything, working on culture, and at the same time trying to be the best of the best and to attract that talent. Because let me tell you, these kids, as you know, and I shouldn't say kids, students, are growing up with access and expectations that they're going to change the world, and they are changing the world. And so there's a lot of talent out there, and you should be, competing to attract that talent to your university so that you can say that you graduated that talent because they're changing the world. And I would just say that I happen to know a young person who recently graduated from this university who now works at Microsoft, and there's a lot of rock stars out there.
Any other thoughts on that from Alice or Claudia?
I'm just hoping it talks about being more flexible, so having environments and institutions and policies that are more flexible to allow for a greater range of people who happen to need accommodations or to be something. I think we just have to think of accommodations as this like separate thing for disabilities. But really, think about like universal design or really inclusion. Accommodations and disability can help so many people. So I think it's going to be, creative environments that allow people to be the best at what they do without these kind of, rules or ways of doing things that are really based on like very narrow ideas of what is work and what is productivity. For whether, not disabled, not disabled or need. So that would be my suggestion.
Great, thank you. Claudia.
I would like to add as well, as both Jill and Alice mentioned with policy, I would like to add attitude. That it's an individual thing, because regardless of the law, the policies, or rules, what have you, you cannot change one's attitude. They need to change that themselves, and once that is changed, then you can be inclusive. It can be diverse, but it may not be inclusive. People use the buzzword diversity, but now let's start doing the inclusionary. which is then asking somebody to dance with you. You know, at the same time, personally, I've seen people in situations, you know, and they're in the thick of it, and they totally are overlooked. So on university campuses, there are a lot of individuals, and that's where it needs to start, with the individual attitudes and the sensitivity in being able to recognize another individual that may be deaf. You know, you hear an announcement being said, you know, while you're eating lunch or something to that effect, or in a group of people and you're carrying on your conversation and there's an announcement. Let them know what was said. You know, I know you can't carry an interpreter everywhere you go. That's been my own personal experience. And it's very, very isolating, even on a college campus. And that's why a lot of students end up, you know, when they go into a mainstream university, they may go through and graduate and get their degree, but it is quite isolating. I remember at the dorm at Howard University, I was, you know, sitting there, you know, and seeing my floor mates getting dressed and getting ready to head out to a party, or in a group of 10, going to the cafeteria. Not one person knocked on my door saying, "Hey, Claudia, you want to join me? We're going here," or "We're going there." Not one person did that. And it's amazing how isolating it is, and the lack of awareness and sensitivity. So it's all about the attitude. You know, that's truly what makes inclusion very attainable. Being aware of your environment and what is going on around you. And perhaps, you know, it is okay to ask. Maybe not grill them, but just, you know, is there anything I can do to help you out? Would you like me to carry this tray for you? Or just simple things. Just simply ask. And, you know, we do understand that disabilities, you know, it's hard to avoid certain situations that crop up. And rather than do the avoidance thing because you're afraid of what may come across or what it looks like or being offensive, imagine if it was the other way around. Imagine the person that does have the disability, out of 4,000 students, they're the only one that may be blind or in a wheelchair. So I would recommend, you know, truly look at your own attitude, yes, as well as the policies too.
Well, thank you. Well, I want to sincerely thank our panelists for this fruitful conversation, and also spend the remaining 10 minutes or so to get any questions that you all have from the audience. So we do have microphones that it looks like Monique is going to help us with making sure that individuals have access to. So if you can just raise your hand if you have a question, please.
Don't be shy.
Oh, here's a question.
Hi, thank you guys for coming. This has been awesome. My name's Sam, and this question's for Claudia. How do you see accessibility playing out at Sprint and in a bigger company?
Okay, well, thank you. Good question. In all actuality, the division that I work for in Sprint is called Sprint Accessibility. So, we are a business unit within Sprint, the corporation, and we focus on providing a broad range of communication solutions for individuals who are deaf, hard of hearing, blind, deaf and blind, people that have speech disabilities. So, you know, we try to figure different products and services that we can provide, such as captioned phones for those who are elderly that may have a bit of a hearing loss. They can speak for themselves, but they're not able to understand 100% of the conversation auditorily. So the phone will print out what the other person is saying to them. And there are other kind of products in the relay service for deaf people. There's an app that can be downloaded. And so they can call using that app as a deaf person. We have conferences that are captioned in the workplace for individuals to be able to be included in a conference call during their work. through remote captioning services that we provide. So as a whole, with our within the business unit, we truly work hard to be sure that we are really going throughout the whole corporation, and I'm very proud to say, you know, we have we're the top #1 company, if you will, with Jill's leadership network, and that she's done every year with the different measurements and stuff, and the screenings and surveys regarding disability policies and hiring practices, internet access, and for the employees' demographics and such. So our numbers are really top-notch. I mean, granted, we're not perfect, but we're truly proud to be a company that is very inclusive, and I'm proud to be a part of that company in addressing these issues.
If I could just add, so Claudia does work in an awesome company, but your question is a really important question, and if ever there was a time to talk about accessibility, it's now, right? Because we are in the midst of an industrial revolution, right? And we've got artificial intelligence and quantum computing and all of these things that are changing the world at warp speed. And if companies aren't doing like what Sprint's doing, if they aren't building accessibility into that right now, then people with disabilities are going to be even further left behind. And so it's so important. And so Claudia was talking about the Disability Equality Index. We have an index, DEI. You can find it online. It's out there. And we added, for example, companies take this, it's a survey, to benchmark where they're at. And the bar's kind of low. And over time, it'll raise. Because what we're trying to do is get more companies in and get them to change their policies and practices to be more inclusive. But there's an unweighted question in there that got added that asks them to go and look at their procurement. Look at the things that they're buying. And are they mandating that the things that they're buying meet the WCAG, the web accessibility content, WCAG 2.0 guidelines, right? Because it's downstream. And if we look at movements like the green movement, like everything going green and being sustainable, we need to build accessibility into that. So the last thing I'd say is there's a book that was just written by the CEO of Microsoft called Hit Refresh. It's all about this topic.
Okay, I have a question. Thank you all for being here. So I identify within a faith community, and just before I share this question, I just really want to lament the ways that we backed out of the ADA in 1990, and yeah, I feel like a lot of faith communities have to take a conciliatory approach towards partnership alongside with and by people with that have disabilities. But I've noticed that is still very slow coming within campus faith organizations or with faith organizations in general. I guess my question is, how would you want faith communities, interfaith communities, to better advocate and to provide spaces where you all are at the table and being involved in decision making and getting us out of the pews or out of the synagogues or mosques and like with you? What can we do to make that happen?
Well, I just thought when I first we just do outreach to particular communities and say, you know, some of the people that are communities of faith are, therefore it's simple and say, we are here for you, we want to listen and understand what your needs are. How to lead you better. So I think, you know, the thing about that I love about disability is that we're everywhere, with every population, culture, community, there will always be disabled people. So wherever you are, whatever your results is, there will always be people with disabilities that are part of your communities that you may not even know about. And I think that's part of the thing too, that there are people with disabilities that don't talk about it because of the shame and stigma. And that's something that we can often impart in terms of making people feel welcome, seen, and heard.
If I may address this as well, just really briefly, thank you very much, first of all, for acknowledging this. And you are right. You know, faith, religion tends to be behind and not accepting of the ADA. But I think there's still a lot of places of worship available that do take on providing accommodations without the ADA, just because it's the right thing to do. As Alice said, you know, people with disabilities are a part of every community, every group, every faith. There's always somebody there that has a disability. And no one is immune to becoming somebody with a disability either. So what you just did, that was an incredible starting point, to acknowledge that the issue is there and to own it. We each need to be accountable for our own actions. And, you know, we worship just like everybody else. And the challenge comes into, within interfaith environment, it's harder, and it does depend on the disability. You know, my disability in the accommodations that I need is not a one-time cost. It's an ongoing cost. For each time I go to church or to Bible study, I need the communication access compared to having a ramp built. That's a one-time cost. So imagine with my request for accommodation, you know, within the faith, I mean, it's a challenge. It is a challenge in that environment. And, you know, there are creative ways to cover the costs, if you think about it. I mean, you can gather offerings or build a fund, you know, do a women's retreat, youth programs, you know, and you can add, you know, as part of the fundraising goals for being able to make the building more accessible. I mean, there are truly very simple, creative ways to do this and to be able to allow people with disabilities accessibility to faith and places of worship. And my own personal experience, when I did lose my hearing, culturally, it was very important for people of faith to not perceive people with disabilities as a curse. Mm-hmm. You know, I was removed from school. I mean, 100% removed from school, and they were focused on healing me. I remember this to this day. You know, my aunt lived in Jamaica. I mean, they're wonderful people. They meant well. I have no ill feelings. It's just the culture. And it was what they knew at the time. And they meant well and wanted what was best for me from their understanding. You know, I lost my hearing, you know, a little bit ago at the time, and there was an unusually large number of people walking up the hill really slow. And I remember seeing this, and, you know, we were in a very isolated part of Jamaica at the time, and very rarely did we have visitors, never mind that many at one time. And I was just doing my own thing, and I realized all of a sudden, oh, they're coming here to my home. And then, oh, and it was the entire congregation from my church had come to my home to pray for me, crying and wailing and pleading to God to bring my hearing back. They meant well, but, you know, I don't look at my disability as a curse to be healed. Do you see what I'm saying? So you got to start there.
Yeah, I think that brings up like the idea that we're not enough, that we're incomplete. And I think if you're a leader of a faith community, one simple message is that you are perfect as you are. And that might be a great place to start.
I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming and being here on this amazing panel. So I had a question about your role as activists. First I wanted to say, Claudia, I'm also from Jamaica, so I just wanted to make that connection. Right. But I find that being committed to trying to dismantle any system can be really discouraging sometimes. It can be really difficult sometimes. And so I'm wondering, what is the vision of the future that you all might have that keeps you going in this kind of fight to dismantle a huge system?
So I could speak for myself and say, like, I am so passionate about what we do that like this week when I was at that conference and sitting on the front row and asked to wave my hand, you know, and felt like disability was at the back of the bus because we were. Like, I went back to my hotel and I was so like I couldn't sleep, right? Like, I was just like, I was up and I was just like, what am I going to do about this? And then I, you know, like, cream rises to the top, baby. And I'm going to work hard. And and from where I sit, I'm like, you know, okay, we got to get facts. We got to get facts and we got to communicate. And we got to, like, get out there and we got to talk about how many businesses that there are that are owned by people with disabilities, and how there are this many that are women and this many that are men and this one that are minority and LGBT, and how we cross every area of disability, right? And how we're in this industry and this industry and this industry, and we're just going to get out there and talk from every mountaintop, and we're not going to go away. But that's like how that's me, right? Like, so I'm not going to get out there and get in their face and tell them, you know, I'm going to get in their face with facts and kindness and just keep on keeping on.
Yeah, I think you know, one tool that I've used that's been incredible is social media. You know, I think we're living in an amazing time where we have our own platforms. You know, I just heard a podcast 4 or 5 weeks ago. It's called Disability on iTunes. Yeah. And it's really about getting our lives, our stories, our facts and figures out there. Yeah, I think social media has a way of really broadcasting it that's really just huge potential in terms of our activism and just really spreading our message and disseminating information.
I believe you were asking the question as to, you know, as an activist in how to deal with the system. I think for me, just as Martin Luther King Jr. says, or Mandela, injustice anywhere is a threat to injustice everywhere. we, I think, have arrived to a place where we are able to get educated and educate. I know there are many of you who are just as intelligent and capable as I am. And there is opportunity, and you must grab the opportunity while it presents itself rather than sit back on your laurels and just allow barriers and doors slamming in your faces. You need to continue to strive and work for what it is, for those opportunities that you want. I meet young people every day, and it keeps me up at night sometimes. I mean, it gets my blood boiling, you know, and it's not about me, it's about everybody else. I mean, we're just as capable, and we want to maximize our own potential and everybody else's potential. So I try to stay visible, and I try to spread the can-do attitude and also project the reality that there is nothing unusual happening here with me. You know, sometimes a non-disabled person gets more hung up on the disability than we are. So we're just trying to show up in, you know, in different places and just be ourselves, and we're just like everybody else. And, you know, people can calm down. And, you know, maybe that will have a ripple effect in and of itself and affect other people. And when those others that do have disabilities, how they interact with those that do not. And social media, like Alice said, it's a wonderful platform. You know, coming to talks like this, you know, it's a very individual thing, and every individual can make a difference.
And just kind of tying together all three of your responses to that question, I think we can all agree there's not a shortage of issues to deal with and that are challenging, I think, all of us as activists. And I think to add to that, we can't expect any one individual person to do it all, but I think that we have to sift through all of that muck to figure out what gets at our core, what makes our blood boil, what keeps us up at night, and how can we leave a legacy and promote other leaders to continue to carry forth this important work. I do want to just say another big thank you to all of our panelists. And leave us with a thought, and that is, in the disability community, there's one particular activist voice, one of many voices, and that is Justin Dart Jr., and he has a phrase that's called "lead on." And what that phrase has really come to mean within the disability community is a mantra of sorts that serves as a call to action and engagement for many who advocate for issues of disability, inclusion, and for all who believe in action and in justice. And so in honor of Justin and all of the voices that we heard here tonight from our wonderful panelists, I want to say lead on and thank you.